Hello viewers, hope you all are doing absolutely fine. So from this video I'm going to start with chapter number 5, that is pollination and fertilization. And under this particular video I will discuss about pollination and its natural types, that is self-pollination and the cross-pollinations. So let's proceed. So before coming on to the types, I would like to discuss about what basically the pollination is. So basically pollination is a transfer of pollens, basically pollen grains, from anther to stigma. So these pollen grains, as in the previous video I discussed that within the anther of the male part of a flower there is pollen sac, and within the pollen sacs there are pollen grains. So basically these pollen grains are to be transferred over the stigma. So basically stigma is the female reproductive part of flower. So the transfer of these pollen grains that are present within the anther towards the stigma is known as pollination. So this is a very basic definition about pollination. So now we will see that the three principal ways that how the pollination occurs is autogamy, it is geitonogamy and allogamy, and we will see each one of them with the help of diagram. Let's start with the first principal way, that is autogamy. So autogamy is basically seen in flower which are bisexual type, and in case of bisexual flower, in case of autogamy where self-pollination is taking place, the main thing which is responsible for this type of pollination is that both gametes of male and female flower are getting matured at same time. So this is a very important point for this self-pollination. So the example of autogamy is hibiscus flower. So in case of hibiscus type of flowers, this autogamy type of pollination is seen. Now basically what happens, as we know that in case of pollination the transfer of anther is taking place towards the stigma. So same flower having both the gametes, so and the maturation time is same for both anthers and the stigma. This is how the anther within anther the pollen grains get onto the stigma during the period of pollination. Now the next principal way of pollination is geitonogamy. In case of geitonogamy, the plant is same but the flowers are different. That means on a single plant, two different flowers are selected for the transfer of anther. Now basically what happens, the stigma is a stationary product. So stigma is stationary, that means the female reproductive parts are not in motion. What moves is the anther that carries pollen grain. Now pollen grains of one flower of same plant will be carried towards the stigma of different flower of same plant. So this is the geitonogamy, and the example of geitonogamy is cornflowers. So this type of pollination is variously seen in cornflowers. Now next, moving on to our third type of pollination, which is known as allogamy. Now basically in case of allogamy, what happens, the flowers are unisexual, and unisexual means that male part is present on one flower and female part is present on different flowers. So basically here allogamy is also defines cross pollination. So cross pollination is commonly seen in these type of plants which are having male and female reproductive parts on different plant of same species. So this is very important, that they will be having gamete, and the gametes or the cross pollination will take place between the same species, different plant. And what is more common in this type of in this type of pollination is that the varieties can vary. So here what we can see, a yellow flower of a same type of species. Suppose this is a male flower of different plant, and the anther of this flower will get transmitted to the stigma of this flower, which is of different color. Now what we can see here, the gene sequences of the two are varying and they will give new variety. So this type of pollination is very much favored by nature. Why? We will see it in a while. So it is favored by nature. So cross pollination example is papaya flower. Papaya flowers are having separate male and female gametes, and we call it unisexuality. So now the next very important part of the chapter is kind of pollination. So first we will see about self-pollination. So we had already discussed about autogamy. Now here what we are seeing, that self-pollination is occurring in same flower. So same flower, we discussed that bisexual flower. So for self-pollination, first thing which is very much important is that the flower should be a bisexual. That means both male and female gametes to be present in the same flower. Another important point here is that another flower of same plant. Now what does it mean that it should be another flower of same plant? Like in geitonogamy, we have seen the plant is same but the flowers are different. Here again, geitonogamy is considered to be self-pollination. So self-pollination is basically about the same plant, and self-pollinations having two different principles, that is autogamy and geitonogamy. In geitonogamy we have seen that different flowers of same plant, and same flower, that means a flower should be a bisexual flower. Now next is about cleistogamy. Now cleistogamy is another type of pollination in which the stigma and the anther lies close. So basically in case of pansy flowers, the anthers and stigma, they are present within the separate closed type of structures, and pansy flowers are mainly responsible for cleistogamy type of pollination. And in what flowers that they are which are growing at the ground level. So basically pansy flower which are growing at the ground level shows cleistogamy, that is a closed anther and stigma. That means from other parts of the plant they are separated, the two are closed in a separate part, and the pollination takes within that closed sac. Example is pansy flowers. Now the two important conditions for the self-pollination is the bisexuality and the homogamy. Now homogamy term defines what I had discussed earlier. It is the maturation of both male and female gametes of a flower at the same time. So this is about self-pollination. So now here we will discuss some of the advantages and disadvantages of the self-pollination. So first I will discuss advantages. Now advantages are like the parental characters will retain. So for example, the red hibiscus flower will give red hibiscus flower. That means we have seen that they are bisexual flower, and due to their bisexuality nature, the anthers and stigma are shared within the same flower. So due to that, the gene sequences are not changing in these type of flowers. So due to the pollination and the formation of offspring, they are giving similar or identical offsprings. That means no changes in the trait. Second is that the pollen grains are utilized fully. So because these type of self-pollination do not require any kind of pollinating agents, and due to presence of bisexuality, the pollen grains are not wasted. They are shared within the same flower. So now we will see some of the disadvantages as well for these type of self-pollination category is that there is no changes in genetic. That means we had seen that the red hibiscus flower, which is a parent flower, will give offspring of a red flower. So this is because of the no genetic changes, and this is the first rule of evolution that changes are mandatory, because if the new offspring, if it will not change its character from generation to generation, that then it will be difficult for it to survive in the new adaptive environment. So basically they get weakened. So after generations of period, what will happen if there will be no changes in genetic sequences? Then the species will get weakened and low chances of improvement in coming generation, and it can lead to the extinct. So now next I will discuss about cross pollination, which is another type of pollination. And what happens in this type of pollination is the anther of one flower is transferred to the stigma of other flowers of same species. Now the species has to be same, otherwise if pollen collected from one species and transferred to the another species, then in a natural condition this method is not possible and the pollen grains will get wasted. Although it can be performed in an artificial manner, that characters from one species selected and transfused into the other species. These things can be done artificially, but in a natural condition this is not possible, and it is very important that same species, it should be same species, the variety may be different, because the cross pollination is very much favoring the varieties, because the gene sequences are getting changes here, and the gene sequences are changing because of the pollinating agents. So basically pollinating agents, they do not know that where they have to transfer the pollen. So if from one variety of one flower the pollens are collected and transferred to the another variety of same species, then the gene sequences of the offspring will get changed and the new variety will be formed. So this is how the cross pollination is very much favored by the nature. And here we can see that anther of one flower is transferred to the stigma of other flower of same species by pollinators. So pollinators are basically the insects and wind. So these are the two agents by which this type of cross pollination are getting possible. Now here are some of the advantages of cross pollination, that these are more viable. So more viable in the sense because they are changing the sequences and the characters are getting adopted from one species variety to the same species and different varieties. That how, and they are becoming viable by changing characters. The characters are not getting identical, the traits are getting varieties. So similarly, the second point under advantages of cross pollination is the new traits. So new traits are formed by the change in the gene sequences. And now here are some of the disadvantages as well for cross pollination, that the loss of pollen grains. So as I discussed, that the pollinating agents, they do not know that where they have to put the anthers, the pollen grains over the stigma. So the loss of pollen, there is loss of pollen grains, and uneconomical for plants. So product of lot of effort. So how they are uneconomical for plant? Because these plants have to be showy, they have to produce nectar. So in the exchange of nectar, they will get the pollen grains for the pollinating purpose, and they also have to produce some scents, and they have to do a lot of effort to get the pollen grains and to be get pollinated. Now one thing more I would like to add here, that the gametes which are present within the pollen grains and within the ovary of a plant, they are haploid cells. So this is again a very important information. Now as I said, that pollination is cross pollination is more accepted by the nature. So these are the advantages, that why they are more selected. So now here we will discuss some of the more point about why cross pollination is accepted by nature. The first is unisexuality, like we had seen in the example of papaya, and we had seen that the male and female gametes are maturing in a different plant of same species, and due to that, or due to the cross pollination, they are making them capable to generate more variety naturally for papaya. Next is dichogamy. So dichogamy is basically the maturation of male and female gametes at different time, despite they are present in the same flower. So if the male gametes of a flower are maturing earlier than the stigma, then it is known as protoandry. Example, sunflower. Protogyny is when the stigma are getting maturated before the maturation of anthers, and such example is custard apple. So next, sterility. So self sterility is basically that the anthers are not accepted by the stigma of the same flower. So suppose in a flower there are stigma and styles, they both are present, but stigma does not accepting the anthers or the pollen grains of its own flower. So this type of self sterility is seen in orchids. Next is hercogamy. So hercogamy is another type of cross pollination in which the pollen grains needed to be transported by the pollinating insect in exchange of nectar. The stigma head is covered with a hood-like structure. So hercogamy is basically seen in pansy flower. So in case of pansy flower, what is happening? The male part or the pollen grains is to be transported with the help of pollinating insects. Why pollinating insects? Because pollinating insects is helping in clearing that hood like structure which is known as a mechanical barrier. So with the help of pollinating agents, the anthers are able to get sticked on the stigma. Now next type is heterostyly, and in case of heterostyly they need pollinating agents, and by pollinating agents, despite they are present on the same plant, and the height of anthers, the flower containing anther is too high, and suppose the stigma containing flower containing stigma are at too low height, so the two at different height cannot self pollinate. So in that case the pollinating agents are required, and this type of heterostyly is seen in oxalis. So this is all from this chapter. In the next video I will discuss about pollinating agents and fertilization, and with that I will cover this chapter. So if you have any query, any doubt, you can write it in the comment section, and you can also follow me on my Instagram. Link is in the description box. And one thing more I would like to add here, that in this particular chapter you will learn so many terms. So if you are finding any difficulty in learning the terms, so you can write it in the comment section. I will give you the mnemonic tricks or any way to make it simpler for you to learn.